Hi, everyone. I'm going to stand here, and that feels strange, but I guess I'll do it. It's the camera. Um, uh, like Tracy said, I'm Nick Tapia-Fuselier, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Leadership Research and Foundations over in the College of Education. And today, we're going to spend a little bit of time, or a lot of bit of time, maybe, exploring 5 big ethical paradigms, right? These sort of ethical paradigmatic possibilities that we should know about, that we should be thinking about, that we should interrogate as we think about ethical decision making. So our time together, I first want to just start off telling you a little bit about myself and how I show up to this presentation. I am nothing if not a qualitative researcher, so I'm like, you have to hear about me first, so then you can hear about the work. I'll talk a little bit about the project that I'm doing as an ethics fellow this year, and I'll talk about why I'm really interested in helping students navigate or think about paradigmatic possibilities in particular. Right, we have these great DFEI principles, right? These 4 ethical principles that are really useful. But I think even beyond that, or sort of before we can arrive to principles, we have to think about paradigms, about epistemological commitments, all those $200 words. We have to think about those big things before we can actually arrive to those principles. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We'll kind of make some connections, I think, back to the DFEI principles. I'll give an overview of the big 5 ethical paradigms, as noted by Luke and Hilton. And then we'll talk about how we might implement paradigmatic possibilities into conversations about ethics. I have a few sort of like dialogue prompts if we're feeling some energy to chat. And then we have time for questions. Cool? Good? Everyone's belly's full? Feel free to get up, get more food, what you gotta do. All right. So a little bit about me. My professional background before engaging my doctoral work was in student affairs and higher education. So I know we have some Sahi student affairs folks in the room. I worked in the areas of first year experience, college access and student success programs, leadership education, community engagement, and more. And so when I transitioned into sort of the academic side of the house, right, my training is primarily as a qualitative researcher. Generally speaking, I won't get too much into my research, but generally I'm interested in how we might transform, and I might say radically transform, post-secondary educational environments in ways that actually center the needs and lived experiences of those who are most marginalized on our campuses, right? So that's kind of the bigger thing that drives my research, but connected more specifically to our time together today is that I'm really interested in positionality work, both empirically and practically speaking, right? When I'm using the language of positionality, I'm talking about how I show up to a particular topic, a particular issue, a particular research question, et cetera, right? How I show up, how we show up. Part of positionality work, I think, implicates paradigmatic commitments, right? It implicates how we come to know things, right? That's what we're using the language of paradigm, really just saying, like, how do we come to know something to be true, right? So I think positionality work informs our paradigmatic commitments. We don't arrive to them in a vacuum, right? We arrive to them as us, as our full selves, our identities, our lived experiences. We bring all of that to the table. The other kind of small thing to know about me, I guess, is I thought it'd be helpful to share a little bit about my general teaching philosophy, right? The project is really going to be implementing some of this work into a course, and so I thought it might be helpful to get a sense of what my courses are like generally. With respect to conversations about ethical decision-making, paradigmatic possibilities, et cetera, I rely on these 3 principles always, but I think they're particularly useful in these conversations. The one, we're all teachers, we're all learners, right? Recognizing we all have unique positionalities, we show up to a particular topic in different ways. All of those ways are valuable, right? I'm not the ethical expert. We all have ethical expertise, right? 2, we want to collectively create and foster brave spaces. This means we're going to be talking about things that should make us uncomfortable, right? That's part of learning. If we're not doing that, we're not learning. And number 3, we're committed to both theory and practice. So we'll be talking about these 5 ethical paradigms, which sounds very theoretical in nature, but my interest is in thinking about how we can apply these into practice. Okay? A little bit about me. So the project that I've been working on, or that I am working on as an ethics fellow, is essentially, oh yeah, that's where it is. Okay, is thinking about ethical paradigms, ethical decision-making in the context of student affairs and higher education, right? So in our department, we have a student affairs and higher education master's program, the SAHI program. Raise your hand if you are familiar with, went through, are currently in. Yes, hi, Alicia. And the field of student affairs and higher ed is really guided by two large documents, right? One would be sort of a professional competencies document drafted by our two leading associations, ACPA and NASPA. The other would be sort of the CAS standards, right? Drafted by CAS. And these guiding documents have ethical implications, right? When we think about our competencies, for example, the very first competency is called personal and ethical foundations, right? So ethics is really at the core of a lot of what we think about and do. And so these guiding documents really align with the DFEI principles in a lot of great ways, right? Making this kind of work easy, which is nice. The next thing that I'm thinking about is, when we think about ethical decision-making, depending on our disciplinary traditions, right, there are probably 100 models that we could find of the flow chart of ethical decision-making. But Navarez and Wood basically evaluated all these and said, most ethical decision-making models come down to 4 phases, right? First, identifying the ethical problem. Second, gathering necessary data. Third, conceptualizing and evaluating alternative courses of action. And fourth, implementing the best course of action, right? Phase 3 in particular is what I'm interested in today, right? What this project is really interested in. Because phase 3 offers us an opportunity to actually engage various paradigmatic possibilities, right? So we'll talk more about that. Sort of the nuts and bolts of the project that I'm working on as an ethics fellow is, one, incorporating some of this content into a required course for our master's in student affairs and higher ed program, right? Our LEAD 5010 course. It's the very first course that students take when they come into the program. So I think it's a nice time to really start thinking about ethics. It's LEAD 5010. The second piece is integrating these principles into some sort of co-curricular experience, right, in collaboration with the student org attached to our program. And then third, I'm interested in offering at least one sort of ethics lunch and learn situation, right? It could be pretty casual, with folks in the Division of Student Affairs, right? Folks who are doing this work, doing higher ed leadership on the ground. So why paradigmatic possibilities? Why am I drawn to this as a way to think more deeply or differently about ethics and ethical decision making? Well, first I would offer that higher education administration, right? And we're talking about folks who run our colleges, right? Big and small, high stakes, low stakes, right? Across the institution. Higher education administration, in many ways, is an ethical enterprise, right? Leaders every day are confronting dynamic, multidimensional, and complex issues, both on our campuses and in our local communities, right? Ethics is not absent of higher ed administrative work. In fact, it is sort of at the center of it, right? So we should name that, we should be conscious of that, and we should responsibly attend to that. Some general ethical dilemmas that, or ethical decisions that higher ed administrators have to make would include, how do we be responsible stewards of our resources, both financial resources and human resources, right? How do we hold students accountable, right? There are ethics embedded in that process. How do we engage in conflict management across institutions, right? Ethics certainly comes into play there. How do we engage in crisis leadership? Certainly ethical dimensions to that, right? We could see 100 of these examples, right? Lots of these things showing up every day, big and small. And so because of this, higher ed leaders must be responsive to our campus or to our changing environments, whether it's related to our campus, whether it's related to evolving sociopolitical dynamics, whether this is related to shifting policy circumstances, right? There's lots happening at the micro and macro levels that implicate issues of ethics. And so I'm really interested in kind of thinking about that more deeply. And I should mention too, and I think this was in kind of the abstract of our time together today, whatever went out in an email, is that I'll be talking primarily from my lens, right? Higher education, student affairs. But for those of us who are not in that field and think, oh no, thanks for the chili, but I gotta go, I might invite you to think about and imagine how this might apply to your own disciplines, right? And you have a fabulous worksheet that Tracy's holding up for us. That might aid your brainstorming. All right. So like I said earlier, right, higher ed leaders at all levels across an institution engage in ethical decision making. And so we want to be conscious of that. We want to understand that the decisions we make do not evade ethics. We need to grapple with it explicitly. So when we think about ethical paradigms, right, these paradigmatic possibilities, they really aid, or they're meant to aid, in our ethical decision-making process, right? Now you will notice they will necessarily complicate our ethical decision-making process, right? We want that. We want complication, right? Ethical dilemmas are tough because they're tough in nature. They're not meant to necessarily be simply resolved. And so ethical paradigms help us look at things through various lenses in an effort to eventually reach a resolution, right? But first we got to do some hard work on our own. So simply put, we can think of ethical paradigms as frames or ways of thinking, right? Ways of thinking that inform the ways we engage in ethical decision making, particularly as it relates to phase 3 of ethical decision making, right? We'll be reminded that phase 3 is around conceptualizing and evaluating alternative courses of action, right? So we can think of ethical paradigms as ways of thinking that can inform, our activities of evaluating different courses of action. So as a reminder, I don't need to tell you all, right? Many of you are experts on this, but I'd be remiss if I did not name the DFEI principles. And so I'll just kind of I have them here. I'll read through them a bit: integrity, right? Trust, accountability, transparency, fairness, respect, rule of law, and viability. What you'll see is, as we go through the ethical paradigms, another thing I'm asking you to do as we kind of engage in this time together is imagine how these things, the ethical paradigms, connect back to some of these principles, right? There are going to be some very obvious connections. There are also going to be some troubling connections, right? Maybe some push and pull. That's okay, right? Ethics isn't meant to be clean and easy. It's hard. It's complicated, right? And so think back on these principles, though, and try to see what kind of connections you can make throughout the presentation. All right. So let's move into the meat of the presentation, the big 5 ethical paradigms. So Wood and Hilton posit that essentially there are 5 big ethical paradigms with which higher education leaders must be familiar, right? Ethic of justice, ethic of critique, ethic of care, ethic of profession, and ethic of the local community. Right, so we're going to take each of these, we're going to unpack it sort of theoretically, right? What do we mean when we're talking about ethic of justice, for example? And then we'll take it a step further and say, what does this look like or feel like in practice, right? What are some reflection questions around these different ethical paradigms? So let's take each one by one. Ethic of justice. So the ethic of justice is an ethical frame that conceptualizes issues, holds confidence in, and enacts decisions based upon the rule of law, as well as more abstract concepts of fairness, equity, and justice. You should be hearing the work of Robert Rawls there, right? These abstract concepts of fairness and equity. So when we think about ethic of justice, right, leaders' decisions are going to be guided through extant laws, through codes, through policies and procedures, right? Simply put, Beckner describes ethic of justice as being rule-based decision-making, right? What do the rules say? Okay. Importantly, ethic of justice, we should be thinking about this as sort of an objective way to engage in ethical decision-making, but also non-consequentialist in nature. What do we think that means? I'm going to be the annoying teacher now. What do you think that means?
You're not looking at the outcome.
Exactly. I'm making an ethical decision, not forecasting the consequences of that decision. I'm actually not going to go there, right? I'm not going to go there. I'm not doing that because if I'm driven by an ethic of justice, those consequences actually aren't important to me making a decision, right?
So would that do rule of law then?
Yeah.
You're talking about the rule
Totally.
of law.
Totally.
Cool.
Definitely connects back to the principle of rule of law, right? Definitely sort of some clear alignment there, right? And we'll see some more clear alignment with some of these other paradigms and maybe some not so clear alignment. But this one absolutely connects back to the principle of rule of law, right? So let's think about this in practice, right? And contextualize it in the higher education leadership space. So higher ed leaders, we know, are affected by rules at all levels, right? Federal level, whether this be judicial rulings, accreditation, federal aid policies, et cetera. The state level, right? State legislatures sort of muddling and making rules, state education coordinating boards, right? We know there are rules coming from the system level, right? Our boards of trustees, et cetera. We also know that there are rules coming from local entities, right? After all, we are in Colorado Springs, right? We have to abide by Colorado Springs law. There's also rules coming from our campus entities, right? We can think of staff assembly, faculty assembly, right? These shared governance models. So from an ethics of justice perspective, higher ed leaders have a responsibility to learn, understand, and abide by rules, codes, and procedures. Right? So in the midst of an ethical dilemma, leaders who are interested in considering the ethic of justice frame, right, the way of thinking, might ask, what are the rules, codes, policies, and procedures relevant to this particular dilemma? Of these rules, are some more pertinent or more important than others? What are the implications for this issue with respect to society? Right? These are the kinds of reflections that we can engage in, right? When we're considering all the paradigmatic possibilities, when we're thinking about ethic of justice, this might be where we're going. Okay? Let's move to ethic of critique. Very different vibe. So the ethic of critique in many ways is juxtaposed to the ethic of justice, right? And that it is explicitly critiquing moral problems caused by the ethic of justice. And moreover, the ethic of critique views laws as historically, and I would argue today, as providing advantages to certain social groups. And so the ethic of justice would say, it's not important if I agree with the law or not, right? The law is the law, the code is the code, the rule is the rule, and that's what I'm doing. Ethic of critique is a different paradigmatic possibility. It starts to grapple with fairness in a new way, right? In a different way. It's informed by critical theory, that should be no surprise, which is concerned with issues of power and inequity. To start, right, if the ethic of justice looks towards fairness, then the ethic of critique is actually looking at barriers to fairness, right? A different ethical paradigm. You see this being different. Ethic of critique is consequentialist. It is concerned with the consequences of our ethical decisions, right? Those consequences are actually prioritized in our decision-making processes. More specifically, ethic of critique brings us to be concerned with how decisions will impact, affect, or disadvantage particular groups of people, right? So let's think about this in practice, right? This feels a bit different than ethic of justice. It's a new possibility, a new paradigm to grapple with. So the ethic of critique can be employed by higher ed leaders who are committed to creating parity for others who have been disadvantaged, particularly in this case, right, in higher ed, in post-secondary contexts. So really, ethic of critique necessitates that we not only follow rules, laws, codes, but we actually grapple with them. We ask hard questions about them. It doesn't mean we don't follow them at the end of the day, but it does mean we can ask questions, right? So in an ethical dilemma, if we are to imagine engaging with the ethic of critique paradigm, we might be asking questions like this. Does one group have certain advantages over others? And if so, how are those advantages sustained? Right? What are the ramifications of those advantages? Does one or more group lack access and voice in the decision-making process? What assumptions are at play? What are the known and unknown values embedded in these assumptions? Right? These are the kinds of reflections that we might have when we're thinking about the ethic of critique paradigm. Cool. Okay. Ethic of care. So this is number 3 of the 5, right? Ethic of care is also juxtaposed to ethic of justice in an interesting way. Mostly, what we want to hear when we hear ethic of care is that the emphasis is primarily placed on people, right? The emphasis of ethic of care is primarily about people. That is, the ethic of care is compassion oriented, right? It is concerned with how decisions issues and circumstances are going to impact the material lives of people, right? And so this is characterized by virtues such as compassion, understanding, and trust. We should hear Carol Gilligan's work here. And this is also consequentialist in nature, right? Remember, ethic of justice, non-consequentialist. I'm not concerned with the consequences on the other end of a decision, right? Before I make it, at least. Ethic of critique, definitely concerned with consequences of a decision. Ethic of care, related, definitely concerned with consequences of decisions, right? So let's think about this in practice, right? If we were to reflect on the ethic of care paradigm, and again, remember, we're thinking about phase 3 of our ethical decision making. So this is where we're starting to deliberate and choose a course of action in the midst of an ethical dilemma. So I'm offering paradigms that help us consider various courses of action, right? And now we're ethic of care. So higher ed leaders thinking about employing ethic of care are encouraged to foster understandings of multiple socio-cultural realities, right? In higher ed, in particular, the ethic of care really places a renewed focus on the people, the students in particular, right? Their development, their success, their goals, their aspirations. It also places emphasis on people like us in the room who are employed by an institution, right? Our development, our growth, our livelihood, right? Ethic of care is prioritizing those things rather than simply prioritizing abstract outcomes, okay? So in an ethical dilemma, when we think about an ethical dilemma and we're grappling with our paradigmatic possibilities, when we get to ethic of care, here are the kinds of things we want to be thinking about. One, how will an issue or a potential resolution affect all members of the institution? Will a decision cause harm, even if unintentionally, to any particular group or entity? In what way, if any, does this issue or potential resolution impact the morale of our organization, right? And finally, how will or does this issue affect the individual's goals and development? These are the kinds of things we're concerned with when we want to start being reflective about ethical care. 2 more, you with me? Okay. 2 more. So 4, ethic of profession, ethic of the profession. It's kind of what this sounds like, right? And it's not disconnected to ethic of justice, right? But the ethic of the profession acknowledges that there are simply guiding values of any profession, right? So there's a lot of higher ed student affairs folks in the room, but think about your own profession. I bet there is a code of ethics, right? Or something that resembles a code of ethics. So we know that these professional codes of ethics are paramount. We know that adhering to those values and ethics is sort of our obligation and our duty as people in that profession, right? And like ethic of justice, ethic of the profession is non-consequentialist, right? It's not interested necessarily in the consequences of our decision. It says, what does the field say is the right thing to do, right? So if we think about this in practice, we know that higher ed leaders operate from an ethic of the profession. For those who do, right, view and adhere to professional codes of ethics in dutiful ways, if you will, right? Bound to those codes of ethics. And additionally, not only being bound to the codes of ethics, but higher ed leaders have a responsibility to sort of interrogate their own position to those ethics, right? How do my beliefs, values, etc., align with or rub up against my field's code of ethics, right? That's part of having an ethic of the profession. So we know that there are ethical guidelines. We talked earlier about the ACPA NASPA professional competencies. I talked about the CAS standards. Think about the field that you're in, right? Sure, there's a code of ethics, some association that says, here are the 5 things that you need to be doing with respect to ethics. In higher ed as well, though, for folks who are in this context, we know that the ACPA NASPA competencies and the CAS standards are not the only places we can look for ethical guidance, right? We can also look to more institutional specific specific associations, such as the American Association for Community Colleges. Their own sort of set of guiding principles. Is it radically different than what the larger field says? No, right? But it is more specific. Or we could even look to functional areas, right? As an example in student affairs, right? Fraternity and sorority life. The AFA offers its own sort of list of ethical guidelines, right? So what that should signal to you is that ethical guidance is around us everywhere, despite discipline. And even within our disciplines, there are lots of places to look to for ethical guidance, right? All in addition to the DFEI principle, of course. So in an ethical dilemma, right, when we're thinking about paradigmatic possibilities, right, ethic of the profession, the things we're going to reflect on is what ethical guidance does my professional association provide, right? I got this thing happening on my campus. What does ACPA and NASPA say about this? What do the CAS standards say about this? That is going to guide my decision, right? Or alternatively, maybe more informally, how would colleagues and peers in the field respond to this ethical dilemma, right? What is the trend? How are people in the field responding? Those are the kinds of reflection questions. Yeah.
Can you tell us what those acronyms stand for?
Oh, sure. It's going to mean it's going to be nothing, but I'll do it. AACC, this is the American Association of Community Colleges.
No, I was thinking the other ones that you've been mentioned.
ACPA and NASPA.
Yes.
It will mean nothing to you, but yes, I will. So ACPA stands for the American College Personnel Association, funnily enough. We don't really go by that anymore. I'm on the governing board of this association. So really it was like ACPA dash College Student Educators International. So Student Affairs Organization. NASPA, the National Association for Student Personnel Administrators. Thank you, Patty. But now that also does NASPA dash something. And then CAS, Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Ed. So these are all higher ed and student affairs associations. Thank you so much.
I like that.
Appreciate that. Any other clarifying questions? This is helpful. I realize I'm acronyming at you. It's a verb, acronyming. Okay, cool. We did this. Okay, lastly, and then we'll have a chance to kind of dialogue a bit. So, ethic of local community. This is the final paradigmatic possibility that I'll offer to us, particularly when we think about higher ed leadership, right? So I should mention that there's a great article that really informed all of this work, much of this work, by talked about J. Luke Wood of the University of San Diego, excuse me, and some of his colleagues, and they actually introduced this. So they were really unpacking the ethics of higher education leadership, and particularly for them, they're community college scholars. They were impacting like what makes community colleges special, and why would they have a different set of ethics? Might they be driven by different ethical paradigmatic possibilities, right? And so they offer to us this, which I think is incredibly useful, not just for community college, right? So the ethic of local community. So the ethic of local community is grounded in the notion that colleges and universities, particularly those that are public, and especially community colleges, must serve the needs, interests, and public good of the local community, right? So this is grounded in historical and contemporary understandings of the responsibilities that public institutions have to their localities, right? We don't just simply exist in Colorado Springs, we actually have duty and responsibility to the city, right? It situates the best interests of the local community as the cardinal principle in decision making, right? It's interesting. It's an interesting way to kind of conceptualize ethical decision making. Importantly, with ethic of local community, our ethical decisions prioritize societal outcomes over individual outcomes, right? So we might be asking ourselves or finding ourselves in a position to ask, is this good just for UCCS, or is this actually good for the city, for the community, et cetera, right? And if we could say yes to that, then it's probably still good for us, right? And again, consequentialist in nature. Absolutely concerned with the consequences of a decision, taking that into account before making the decision, right? So when we're thinking about, our paradigmatic possibilities, we're trying to find a course of action. When we start to think about local community, we can operate, or when we operate with ethic of local community, we adhere to community-based decision-making processes, right? This acknowledges that localized decision-making is actually going to be much more attuned to our context, right? Our local strengths and our local challenges. In an ethical dilemma, we might consider what are the implications or ramifications for the local community with respect to this particular issue? What potential courses of action would promote the best interest or the greatest good for the community? And how would the community perceive or react to particular issues or potential courses of action? So again, it's consequentialist in nature, right? But the focus isn't necessarily on care, although we can hear that implicated, but it's explicitly focused on the local community. What you should hear here as well, is that this is localized not only in theory, but in practice, meaning if we were to sort of like look at different ethical decisions that are being made across the country, where leaders are attending to the ethic of local and community, because those decisions are localized in nature, they might look very different from the other, right? That's a unique feature of this paradigm, right? I think it makes it a really big strength, but also makes it harder to think about in the abstract, because you really do need to understand a context in order to grapple with it. Sure.
I have a question about that. I mean, I like the way that you explain it, but an issue like when the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, when we came up with these principles, which we came up with them, 8 professors of us, many moons ago. But one of the things they said is that they are not situational. And when you get local community in there, you're not saying it's situational that one ethical decision might be okay, that isn't really okay, but because of the community. How do you deal with that?
So what I would say is these are not, I would make sure that we're conceptualizing these and processing these not as principles, but as paradigmatic possibilities. I don't know
things to consider.
Things to consider, and particularly when we're considering courses of action, right? And so, I would say this is situational. I would, but I would also say this is a principle based, right? So it should be connected to principles, but it isn't an alternative to the principles. It's actually something that kind of happens prior to arriving to a principle, in my view.
And it does make it, I like the idea of not just think of yourself, but think of your community.
Absolutely. All right. So we talked about the big 5. Oh, sorry.
I just have a quick thing to kind of throw in there, and it may be a little bit ahead of them. but I'm just thinking in terms of remote and online.
Sure.
So that is, I feel that is going to change a little bit of this.
Sure.
And so I was just
community is now
exactly right. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts are that's an incredible thought. What is local in 2022? That's a really good question. What is local when we have students from across the world engaging in our curriculum?
Right.
I think that does pose a shift or just expansion, right? I don't really see it as anything different. I think it expands our understandings. Maybe it doesn't change it.
So with the fact that you mentioned, ethics are sometimes gray, which is really true. And the fact that you got those 5, and some of them are non-consequential less than some of them are consequential. When you run into a conflict between the big 5 and how you're going to make your decision. Because I'm sure that is inevitable. At some point, you lose certain decisions.
Sure.
How do you go about determining the right path? Which one would be more ethical rather than less ethical based upon those big 5?
I mean, I think you're posing the ethical dilemma in and of itself, right? That choosing the course of action is the final phase of ethical decision making. I'm offering possibilities to consider as you evaluate courses of action, but ultimately, leadership is about, right? And I say leadership with a lowercase l, meaning I can see us all as leaders. Leadership is about choosing a course of action that you can defend, right? And that ultimately, we've talked about paradigmatic possibilities, right? But if I'm connected and committed to a set of principles, I also want to return to those, right? So I think it's what I'm offering is a way to kind of, I'm going to use this language later, fruitfully complicate the ethical decision-making process in order to arrive at decisions, right? But in terms of how to choose, you let me know, right? We will come to decisions as leaders faced with ethical dilemmas, but I don't know that there's a silver bullet there. I don't know.
So I'm wondering, how is this, or why don't they call this stakeholders? Like
stakeholders.
Oh, the ethic of local community instead of that, calling it the ethic of like stakeholders, like engaging stakeholders. Because I know that local community is very situational. And I'm just wondering, because I haven't read the literature that you're referring to, and
I think, a part of, so I appreciate your attention to language and detail. I would also say that stakeholder might be as mucky as the local community, right? What I might identify and who I might identify as stakeholders may not be who we all identify as stakeholders to UCCS, as an example. It might help us get a little more specific, particularly considering Angie's point, right, about like, what is community in the virtual world. But yeah, there's certainly they use the language of stakeholder. I'm not really using it, but the language of stakeholder is pretty prominent throughout this work, particularly when we think about ethic of care, right? They talk a lot about stakeholders. They also have broad definitions of stakeholders, right? Definitions of stakeholders that we may in this room say, is that person actually a stakeholder? Like that doesn't feel quite right to me. So yeah, good point. Yeah.
Well, if they want to get specifically at the local community, then
exactly
like the town gown thing.
Yeah, and you should, for context too, and I mentioned this, but I'll put a point on it, is David Wood in particular is sort of a preeminent community college scholar. His emphasis in research is solely on the 2-year context.
Okay.
And we know that historically, right, the missions of a community college is fundamentally about community. So I think that's also why the language was chosen the way it was. Yeah.
Thank you.
I saw your hand. Yes.
Just it's one area I think about through education and you think about rural education.
Yeah.
It gets very mucky through the stakeholder.
Yeah.
I mean, in small towns, have teachers there. So when you have that battle of who is that stakeholder, is it to build this community and help this community, or taking away talent by educating and moving that somewhere? Well, then it's a stakeholder somewhere else. That child will die in the doctor of the city. Well, when those stakeholders be taking away that person,
yeah.
Because I almost feel like this is a small synopsis of that little image of the people, the boys standing behind the baseball field. And in that scenario, the fence they can't see over. All get a box the exact same size, which they all get a box that allows them to be able to see.
Right.
And then they'll have to figure out that.
Yeah, no, that's
But you know, when we look at that scenario, these all interplay on each other.
Totally.
You know, to your point of what is the right?
Yeah.
I think the point of this is looking at these 5 as an avenue to find this isn't the right thing to do. It's the thing you can do it now.
Yeah. I think.
Can you repeat what he said just in case it doesn't?
Oh gosh.
Hear.
I will.
In general, summarize it.
Hey Beth, I'm going to give you a brief synopsis. All right. We're talking about kind of the sort of muckiness that could come with engaging with the ethical local community, particularly with rural environments, people sort of leaving and coming in of rural and urban environments, and the stakeholder kind of concept becomes fuzzy. We talked about it related to issues of equity, right? If you think about this, sorry, I'm like visualizing everything said. If you think about the image of the baseball field and there's a fence and there are boys behind the fence and they have the same size box, but they can't all see over it. So now they need different size boxes, right? And then really the last image is what if we just don't have a fence, right? So the last point that your name, Corey, made was that perhaps making ethical decisions requires us to evaluate, right? It kind of gets back to the ethical decision-making process, gather all the data we can and make the most right decision, right? The thing that came up for me as you were talking was Carol Gilligan always talks about maybe not what is the right thing to do, but what is the most right thing to do. I see your hand, Sloan. Let me just get through one more slide, and then Sloan has first dibs. All right. So what? You're saying, Nick, enough. So what? And here's
No. Did it die?
Oh, here we go.
There we go. It's back.
It's like literally the universe is like, so what? Enough of that. Yeah. All right. So kind of to wrap us up, right? I just put a bow on this, and then we're getting to Sloan. Is generally ethical decision making, as we remember, occurs in these 4 phases, right? Identifying the actual ethical problem, gathering all of our data, right? What do we need to know? Maybe this is in part identifying what do we mean when we say stakeholder? What do we mean when we say local community, right? 3, evaluate or conceptualizing and evaluating alternative courses of action. What are our possibilities here, right? That's what I hope you expanded a bit today, is these different paradigms to explore these possibilities, right? And then finally, making the choice, implementing that course of action, right? Perhaps not the right thing to do, capital R, but the most right thing to do, right? Based on the data we have. So as we examine these various ethical dilemmas, when I think about the work that we do in our program, in this SAHI program, is a lot of case study work, a lot of trying to, again, bring these theoretical concepts into practice, right? Imagining them in real life examples. Hopefully we can use these big 5 ethical paradigms. We can leverage them to unpack, uncover, and interrogate various courses of action, right? So some dialogue ideas that I have, but we're already moving, so I'm just going to offer these to us and then we'll keep moving. One, where do we see some strong alignment? We've already done some of this between the ethical paradigms and the DFEI principles. 2, how might you introduce sort of ethical paradigmatic possibilities into your conversations with students or colleagues or friends about ethical decision making? And finally, in what ways might ethical paradigmatic possibilities fruitfully complicate our discussions with students about ethical dilemmas? All right, Sloan.
Real loud, Sloan, because Michael, come over closer.
I'm loud.
Okay.
I just was gonna add, I love this empathy of local community idea, because I feel like going along with your dialogue and thinking about student work, of asking that question as a campus, like when do we respond? When do we act? When is the recent, like, what do we do? Right? And that was a question we all had, right? With like, do we respond? Do we send something? Do we go to like, and it's taking those and what are our values, what are our principles, and what's happening around us, and where's that connection point? And so I think looking at it from that, again, like you said, it's not about me, it's about what's happening and then how can I reconcile that with mine.
Yeah.
You know, so it's such an interesting, I haven't heard of that one in like all the ethic work. And so I think it was just such a just an interesting way of thinking about like that has a huge element that we think about, but we don't often, I think with ethics we never go through and have an ethical decision right now, right?
Yeah.
But in that framework, in that thinking, it is such a huge question in the US that I'm not realizing. Right? Like how is this decision impacting what's going on around me? And so I just want to say that I thought it was incredible and I'm glad we shared it. So that was my comment.
Thank you, Sloan.
And then I kind of think your question.
Yeah, I think too, what you're kind of touching on is like, I think that paradigmatic possibility, ethic of local community, but all of them really start, it makes us turn inward, as I'm saying inward personally, but also as a collective, right? As leaders of units or institutions, to say, who am I responsible to? Not only what am I responsible for, but who am I responsible to? Right? Those are not easy questions. And hopefully this just gives you new language, expanded language to examine and interrogate that responsibility. Yeah.
I thought it's so valuable. I've never, clearly when it's a dilemma, it's because it's not clear.
Yes.
Direction, right? You're going to hurt somebody or it's not clear. So to think that you could actually have people representing those 5 voices, and I'm thinking as a campus, we're building an engineering building around a tree. Enormous work was done to find that solution.
Yeah.
That hopefully, and I was also thinking that part, what Clint said, if by having the voice of the ones that are outcomes focused, even if you cannot make all the people happy, which is the dilemma, it may at least inform you about who you communicate and how you do, right? It's not going to be a blanket email. Right. Some people need to be brought in or show that care, even though you may not have made the decision. This is it makes me think of Blue Bloods, where the chief has to make a decision and the 3 staff are like, you should do it this way. And we're all like, which way will we go?
Yeah, we can kind of think of these as like 5 different folks, in a boardroom, like saying, well, what's the rule? What's the code? Like, what's the procedure, right? And the other person saying, well, what's the impact on the people, right? Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, so we're talking a lot about how these kinds of decisions will impact the community and everybody around us and keep us from making snap decisions and, with catastrophic results. But isn't there also a part of this that is kind of selfish? Like you're laying down at night at the end of the day and you're like, did I make the right decision? Like I need to be able to sleep at night. And I think that all of these different paradigms can help us make sure that we internally and emotionally feel like, I know I considered everything, even though not everybody's been happy. So I think there is a little bit of selfish drive to consider all of these components as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think it helps us, it kind of connects back to your point of, it helps us justify the decisions we've made because we've considered, we've engaged in phase 3. Like we've really considered and conceptualized and evaluated the possibilities, right? Probably to a frustrating degree, right? And then we still had to make a decision, right? I think that consideration is not in vain, right? Yeah, it helps us sleep better at night, but it also helps the press release the next morning. It helps us communicate to the folks, to stakeholders, whoever those might be, right? It also helps us, I think, these paradigmatic possibilities helps us understand why we're getting critique. I'm thinking of putting my like administrator hat on. Why is everyone mad about a decision I made? All right, well, I was doing ethic of justice. This is the policy. I'm not thinking about this now means you're out of the program, or this now means, I'm not thinking about the consequence. This is the policy, right? Ethic of justice, I'm doing this. But I can empathize a little bit better with the person on the other end if I understand that they're not operating with an ethic of justice. They're saying, what about care? What about me, right? Or they're saying, what about local community? What about us, right? It helps me understand other points of view as well. So that I can actually like sit with those, interact with those in meaningful ways, right? Rather than saying, the policy is a policy. I don't know, go cry somewhere else. I don't know what to tell you. Right? Yeah.
I'm so excited when you're talking about this. So I had a professor when we were doing like our reading thing, and he says, okay, you're going to read the giving tree as a certain perception of maybe one of these 5. And that would be a great way to, you know, come together and see how different these 5 different pieces are. And would be a fun thing.
Cool. Yeah, because they really are frames, right? They're ways of thinking. One is not better than the other. Let me also put a point on that, right? We sort of need all of these possibilities, right? We need them all. One is not better than the other. I think maybe last.
I think part of, you know, when you talk about being able to sleep at night, things like that is not just thinking about the big 5, but thinking about your integrity, thinking about accountability and transparency with people and fairness. If you're involving those in your decisions with the big 5, that's going to help you if you know you've got integrity and you know you're being accountable to the decisions that you're making. That's really going to, as an individual, help you feel better about any ethical decision that you may be making in leadership and in life.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think too, and then we'll kind of put a bow on this, and I'm not sure what's next in the agenda, so Tracy can come back up. But it makes me think of like, if these are the expanded possibilities, right? And now I'm utilizing new ways to think about some things, and these are the non-negotiables, right? Because I want to make sure that I'm articulating this clearly, right? These are, I'm not presenting principles. I'm presenting paradigms, right? But these principles are still here. So these represent possibilities, but at the end of the day, I'm also returning to the non-negotiables, right? I think that's kind of what we're picking up on and what we're kind of talking about as a group. I think that's really useful. Any final questions or thoughts or things you need from me? Yeah.
I'm just sort of back to what you said earlier, when something that is the situation. Did you just break that?
Wait.
We're going someplace that we don't necessarily want to go on. So these are not situational. We spend a lot of time finding these particular things and we say they're not situational.
Yeah.
But then we look at the 5 different paradigms.
Yeah.
Don't they always have to be situational? Because based on, if we're looking at 5 different viewpoints.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there, you could make a decision on any one of those. Sure. Lean towards one or the other.
Yeah.
It almost seems like, although these want to be our core has to have some balance.
I think this is a useful complication of what we're talking about, right? What I might offer is, and this is not a clean, maybe not a satisfying answer, but what I might offer is like both can be true at the same time, right? That these can be core and that possibilities do, they necessarily expand our paradigmatic choices, our opportunity, right? Like there is a push and pull here that is actually useful in ethical decision making. It doesn't make it easier. Let me just remind us, I did not promise I'd make it any easier today. I said I'd make it harder. So I hope I've done that. Thank you. That's what